a Honolulu 1972 cold case solved after nearly 50 years, and the arrest shocks an entire community to its core. Nancy Anderson, just 19 years old, moved from Michigan to paradise, chasing dreams under Hawaiian sunshine. But on the 7th of January, 1972, those dreams turned into a nightmare when she was found brutally stabbed in her own Waikiki apartment. For decades, her family refused to give up, even as leads went cold, and suspects vanished into the shadows. Then, in 2021, a breakthrough no one saw coming. DNA evidence pointed to Tudor Chirila, a respected Nevada attorney, who had lived a quiet, respectable life for 50 years. How does a killer hide in plain sight for half a century? What secrets was this man carrying all those years? And when the past finally catches up with the present, will justice truly be served, or will some wounds never heal? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The trade winds carried the scent of plumeria through Nancy Anderson's small apartment window as she arranged her few belongings in the cramped space that would be her new home. At 19, she possessed that particular brand of courage that comes with youth, the kind that makes crossing an entire continent seem like just another adventure. Her family in Michigan thought she was crazy, leaving everything familiar for a job at Sears in downtown Honolulu. But Nancy had always been drawn to the unknown. The apartment building on Kiyomoku Street wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She shared the second floor with Mrs. Yamamoto, an elderly Japanese woman who had welcomed Nancy with homemade mochi and stories about the old Hawaii before statehood changed everything. The building housed a mix of locals and transplants like Nancy, young people chasing dreams in America's newest state, older residents who remembered when Honolulu was a different kind of place. Nancy's days fell into a comfortable rhythm. She would wake early, dress in her neat Sears uniform, and walk the few blocks to work. The department store buzzed with tourists and locals alike, and Nancy found she had a natural talent for helping customers find exactly what they needed. Her supervisors noticed her reliability, her genuine smile, and the way she never complained about the long hours or difficult customers. In the evenings, she would write letters home on thin airmail paper, describing the coconut palms, the sound of the ocean, and the way the sunset painted the sky in colors she had never seen in Detroit. "I'm really making something of myself here," she wrote to her mother in her careful handwriting. "This feels like where I'm supposed to be." But even in paradise, evil can find a way in. The 7th of January, 1972, started like any other Sunday. Nancy had planned a quiet day, maybe a walk to the beach, some reading, perhaps a phone call home. The morning sun filtered through her curtains as she prepared a simple breakfast. She had made friends with some of the other young people in the building, and they sometimes gathered on Sundays to share stories and dreams about their island life. Mrs. Yamamoto later told police she heard Nancy's radio playing around noon, a soft melody drifting through the thin walls. She thought nothing of it. Nancy often listened to music while cleaning her apartment or writing letters. The building was typically quiet on Sunday afternoons, most residents either at beach or visiting family. It was Nancy's friend Karen who found her. Karen had come by around 4 in the afternoon, planning to invite Nancy for a sunset walk along Waikiki Beach. She knocked several times, calling Nancy's name. The radio was still playing, but there was something else, a stillness that felt wrong. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. Many residents left their doors open during the day, trusting in the safety of their small community. What Karen found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. Nancy lay in the small living room, her young life ended by multiple stab wounds. The violence was shocking. In its intensity, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong, or a crime of opportunity. Someone had wanted Nancy Anderson dead, and they had made sure of it. Karen's screams brought Mrs. Yamamoto running, and within minutes, the quiet building was filled with police sirens and the flash of cameras. Honolulu in 1972 was still a relatively small community, and violent crime, especially against young women, was rare enough to shock the entire city. Detective Robert Kauakahi was among the first responders. A native Hawaiian who had joined the police force after returning from Vietnam, he had seen violence before, but something about Nancy's murder struck him differently. Maybe it was her age, or the fact that she had come so far from home to start a new life, only to have it end so brutally. Whatever it was, Kauakahi made himself a promise. As he surveyed the crime scene, he would find whoever did this. The investigation began immediately. Nancy's apartment was small, which meant the crime scene was contained, but it also meant there were fewer places for evidence to hide. The killer had been thorough, but not perfect. There were signs of a struggle, indicating Nancy had fought back. Under her fingernails, investigators found what they hoped would be crucial evidence: skin and blood that didn't belong to the victim. In 1972, DNA testing was still decades away, but the evidence was carefully preserved and catalogued. Detective Kauakahi interviewed everyone in the building, everyone Nancy worked with, anyone who might have known her routine or had access to her apartment. The list of potential suspects began to grow. There was Jimmy, the maintenance man who had keys to all the apartments and had been seen talking to Nancy on several occasions. He seemed genuinely shocked by her death, but his alibi for Sunday afternoon was shaky. He claimed to have been home alone, watching football. Then there was Michael, a young man who lived downstairs and had asked Nancy out several times. She had politely declined, explaining that she wasn't interested in dating anyone seriously while she was still getting settled. Michael insisted he harbored no hard feelings, but neighbors had noticed him watching Nancy's comings and goings with unusual interest. Nancy's supervisor at Sears mentioned a customer who had been bothering Nancy recently, an older man who would come in asking for her specifically and making conversation that went beyond the usual pleasantries. Nancy had mentioned feeling uncomfortable, but she hadn't wanted to make trouble for a customer. Each lead seemed promising at first, but as Detective Kauakahi dug deeper, alibis emerged, or witnesses came forward with information that eliminated suspects one by one. The investigation that had started with such urgency began to slow, then stall. Months passed. Nancy's family flew to Hawaii for the funeral, a heartbreaking service attended by the friends she had made in her short time on the island. Her mother, Helen Anderson, was a strong woman who had raised Nancy alone after her husband died young. Standing beside Nancy's grave in the shadow of Diamond Head, Helen made her own promise she would never stop seeking justice for her daughter. The case remained active, but as 1,972 turned into 1,973, and then into 1,974, other crimes demanded attention. New detectives rotated onto the case, each bringing fresh eyes but finding the same cold trail. The evidence was carefully maintained, the files meticulously kept, but Nancy Anderson's murder began to fade from public memory. Only her family refused to let it go. Detective Kauakahi retired in 1995, but not before training his replacement, Detective Lisa Chen, on the nuances of Nancy Anderson's case. Chen was a second-generation Chinese-American who had grown up in Honolulu, and she understood both the island's close-knit community dynamics and the way serious crimes could ripple through generations. "This one gets under your skin," Kauakahi told Chen during their last case review together. 23 years, and I still see that girl's apartment in my dreams. Someone out there knows what happened, and they're walking around free. Chen inherited not just the case files, but also regular phone calls from Helen Anderson. Every few months, Nancy's mother would call from Michigan, always polite, always hopeful, asking if there had been any new developments. The conversations were heartbreaking. Helen was aging, her voice growing thinner with each passing year, but her determination never wavered. "I know you're doing everything you can," Helen would say. "I just need to know that Nancy isn't forgotten." Nancy Anderson was far from forgotten, but the case presented challenges that seemed insurmountable. With 1,992nd technology, the physical evidence was well preserved. The skin samples, blood traces, and fiber evidence collected from the crime scene had been stored properly and remained viable for testing. The problem was that there was nothing to compare them to. In the pre-internet era, cross-referencing suspects across state lines was a laborious process. If Nancy's killer had moved away from Hawaii after the murder, which seemed likely given the lack of similar crimes in the islands, he could be anywhere in the world. Without a known suspect to test against, the physical evidence was like having half of a conversation. Detective Chen spent years revisiting the original suspect list, tracking down people who had been interviewed in 1972. Some had died, others had moved away, but she managed to locate and re-interview dozens of individuals who had been in Nancy's orbit during those final weeks. The maintenance man, Jimmy, had moved to the mainland and was working construction in Nevada. Nancy's downstairs neighbor, Michael, had joined the military and served tours in Korea and Germany before settling in California with a wife and 3 children. Each interview yielded the same result: expressions of sympathy for Nancy and her family, vague memories of a young woman who had seemed happy and well-liked, and nothing that pointed toward a killer. The case took on new urgency in 1999 when DNA testing became more sophisticated and widely available. Chen arranged for the preserved evidence to be tested, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, there was real progress. The skin and blood samples yielded a clear male DNA profile, someone who was not Nancy Anderson and who did not match any of the suspects who had voluntarily provided samples over the years. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database, but there were no matches. Still, for the first time since 1972, Investigators had something concrete, a genetic fingerprint of Nancy's killer. Now, they just needed to find him. Helen Anderson was nearly 80 when Detective Chen called with the DNA news. "Does this mean you'll catch him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means we have a much better chance," Chen replied carefully. "Science is getting better every year. Someday, this profile is going to match someone in the system." But Helen Anderson didn't have someday. She died in 2003, 31 years after her daughter's murder, never knowing who had taken Nancy's life or why. At her funeral in Detroit, Nancy's younger brother David spoke about his mother's unwavering faith that justice would eventually prevail. "She never gave up," David said to the small gathering of family and friends. "Even at the end, she was asking about Nancy's case. Someone out there knows what happened, and Mom always believed that someday, somehow, the truth would come out." David Anderson inherited more than his mother's belongings. He took on her mission. Unlike Helen, who had relied on police updates and phone calls, David had access to the internet and social media. He created websites dedicated to Nancy's case, posted on forums devoted to unsolved crimes, and connected with other families dealing with similar losses. Through his online advocacy, David learned about advances in forensic genealogy, the process of using DNA evidence to build family trees and identify suspects through their relatives. It was a long shot, but it was also a new tool that hadn't existed when Nancy was killed. In 2018, David reached out to CECE Moore, a forensic genealogist who had gained national attention for her work on cold cases. Moore was intrigued by Nancy's case. The DNA evidence was strong, and the crime was heinous enough to warrant the considerable time and expense involved in genetic genealogy work. Moore's process was methodical and painstaking. Using the DNA profile from Nancy's killer, she built a genetic family tree, identifying distant cousins and working backward through generations to find common ancestors. The work required not just scientific expertise, but also old-fashioned detective work, searching through birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data to piece together family histories. After months of work, Moore began to narrow down the possibilities. The DNA pointed to a family line that originated in Eastern Europe, with ancestors who had immigrated to the United States in the early 1900s. By early 2019, she had identified several potential suspects, all men who would have been adults in 1972 and who had some connection to Hawaii. One name stood out: Tudor Chirillo. Born in 1944, Chirillo had emigrated from Romania as a child and grown up in California. He had attended law school and passed the Nevada bar exam in 1970. Most importantly, records showed that he had traveled to Hawaii in late 1971 and early 1972, exactly the time frame when Nancy Anderson was killed. Detective Chen, now a lieutenant supervising the cold case unit, felt her pulse quicken when Moore called with the potential match. After nearly 5 decades, they might finally have a name, but identifying a suspect was only the first step. Chirillo was still alive, living quietly in Reno, Nevada, where he had practiced law for decades. He was 74 years old, married, with adult children who knew nothing of any connection to a decades-old murder in Hawaii. The investigation into Tudor Chirillo revealed a man who had lived an apparently respectable life. He had specialized in estate planning and real estate law, serving clients throughout Nevada. His neighbors described him as quiet and polite, a man who kept to himself but was always willing to help with neighborhood concerns. There was nothing in his background to suggest he was capable of the brutal violence that had ended Nancy Anderson's life. But appearances can be deceiving, and Detective Chen knew that many killers had lived double lives, maintaining facades of respectability while hiding terrible secrets. The challenge was obtaining a DNA sample from Chirillo without alerting him to the investigation. If he was indeed Nancy's killer, tipping him off could result in his fleeing or destroying additional evidence. Chen worked with Nevada authorities to conduct surveillance of Chirillo, looking for opportunities to collect discarded DNA, a coffee cup from a restaurant, a cigarette butt, anything that might yield a sample for comparison. The break came in March 2020, when Chirillo visited a medical office for a routine appointment. Nevada detectives, working in coordination with Chen, were able to obtain a discarded tissue from a waiting room trash can. The sample was rushed to the lab for testing. On the 15th of April, 2020, Chen received the call she had been waiting for since 1999. The DNA was a match. After 48 years, they knew who had killed Nancy Anderson. The arrest of Tudor Chirillo on the 22nd of April, 2021, sent shockwaves through 2 communities separated by thousands of miles and nearly 50 years. In Honolulu, Detective Chen held a press conference that drew reporters from across the Pacific, all eager to learn how a cold case from 972, had finally been solved. In Reno, neighbors and former clients struggled to reconcile the quiet attorney they had known with the brutal killer described in the charges. After 49 years, we finally have answers for Nancy Anderson and her family, Chen announced to the gathered media. This arrest would not have been possible without advances in DNA technology and the tireless work of forensic genealogists. It also serves as a reminder that law enforcement never gives up on these cases. The details of Chirila's arrest were as shocking as they were anticlimactic. Nevada police arrived at his modest ranch home on a quiet Tuesday morning, finding the 77-year-old man tending to his garden. He offered no resistance, seemed almost relieved when they read him his rights, and made no statements beyond requesting an attorney. David Anderson was at work in Detroit when his phone rang with the news he had waited his entire adult life to hear. "They got him," he told his wife, tears streaming down his face. "They finally got him." The road to trial would prove more complicated than the arrest. Chirila's defense team, led by experienced Nevada criminal attorney Sarah Martinez, faced the challenging task of defending a man whose DNA was found under the fingernails of a murder victim. Their strategy focused on the passage of time, the degradation of evidence, and the possibility of contamination during the decades the samples had been stored. "This case is built on science that didn't exist when this crime was committed," Martinez argued during pre-trial hearings. "DNA testing in 2021 is sophisticated, but we're asking it to interpret evidence that's nearly 50 years old. There are questions about chain of custody, storage conditions, and the possibility that samples could have been compromised." Prosecutor James Wong countered with a methodical presentation of the evidence. The DNA match was overwhelming. The odds of the genetic material belonging to someone other than Chirila were astronomically small. More importantly, investigators had uncovered additional evidence linking Chirila to Hawaii during the time frame of Nancy's murder. Records showed that Chirila had taken the Nevada bar exam in February 1971, but had then disappeared from Nevada for several months. Hotel records, long since destroyed, couldn't confirm his presence in Hawaii, but airline manifests from early 1972 showed a Chirila on flights between Los Angeles and Honolulu during the weeks before and after Nancy's death. Perhaps most damning was Chirila's own behavior after returning to Nevada. He had rented a small apartment in Reno, paid several months' rent in advance, and then vanished again for nearly a year. When he finally surfaced in 1973, he had established the law practice that would define the rest of his life, but he had never spoken publicly about his travels or explained the gap in his professional timeline. The trial began in September 2021, with David Anderson traveling from Detroit to observe the proceedings. At 68, he was the same age his mother had been when she died, still seeking justice for Nancy. Sitting in the courthouse, surrounded by strangers discussing the details of his sister's death, David felt the weight of nearly 5 decades of wondering and waiting. Chirila, now 77, and visibly frail, sat quietly at the defense table throughout the proceedings. He showed no emotion as prosecutors displayed crime scene photographs, described the brutality of Nancy's death, and presented the DNA evidence that linked him to her murder. Only once did he react when David Anderson took the stand to provide victim impact testimony. Chirila looked directly at him, his expression unreadable. "Nancy was 19 when she died," David told the jury, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "She was smart and funny, and brave enough to cross the entire country to chase her dreams. She never got to have a career, never got to fall in love, never got to have children. Our mother died without knowing who took Nancy away from us. This man stole my sister's future, and he stole my mother's peace of mind." The defense presented character witnesses who testified about Chirila's decades of community service, his reputation for honesty in his legal practice, and his devotion to his family. They painted a picture of a man who had lived an exemplary life, whose only connection to Nancy Anderson was a piece of genetic material that could have been contaminated or misidentified over the decades. But the DNA evidence was too strong to overcome. On the 15th of October, 2021, after deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on charges of second-degree murder. Chirila, who had maintained his silence throughout the trial, finally spoke when asked if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing. "I am sorry for the loss of Nancy Anderson," he said, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I am sorry for the pain her family has endured." It wasn't a confession, but it was an acknowledgement that carried weight after decades of silence. Judge Patricia Nakamura sentenced Chirila to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 77, it was effectively a death sentence, though a more humane one than the violent end he had given Nancy Anderson. This case represents both the triumph of modern forensic science and the enduring power of families who refuse to give up. Judge Nakamura said during sentencing. Nancy Anderson's family waited nearly 50 years for justice, but their persistence, combined with advances in DNA technology, has finally provided answers. Outside the courthouse, David Anderson faced a crowd of reporters, many of whom had covered the story from the beginning. Nancy would be 70 years old if she were alive today, he said. She would probably have grandchildren by now. This verdict doesn't bring her back, but it means her killer will finally face consequences for what he did. The story didn't end with the verdict. Chirila's conviction opened new questions about other unsolved crimes from the early 1972. His travel patterns during that period remained largely unknown, and investigators across the country began reviewing cold cases that might be connected to the man who had hidden his violence behind a respectable facade for nearly half a century. C.E. Moore, the genealogist whose work had identified Chirila, reflected on the case during a television interview after the trial. Nancy Anderson's case shows us that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of surfacing, she said. Families who never give up, combined with advances in science, can achieve justice even decades after a crime. Tudor Chirila died in prison in March 2023, 18 months after his conviction. He had never provided details about Nancy's murder, never explained what had led him to kill a young woman he likely barely knew, never showed remorse beyond his brief statement at sentencing. His death prompted mixed reactions from those who had followed the case. Some felt cheated of the opportunity for him to provide answers about Nancy's final moments. Others, including David Anderson, found peace in knowing that Chirila had died behind bars, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom gone. Nancy got justice, David said at a memorial service held in Honolulu on the 52nd anniversary of her death. It took 5 decades, but she got justice. The case became a symbol of the growing power of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, inspiring other families to push for renewed investigations of decades-old crimes. More importantly, it served as a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, that killers can live among us for decades, maintaining facades of respectability while carrying terrible secrets. In Honolulu, Nancy Anderson's grave in the shadow of Diamond Head now bears a small additional inscription, Justice Served 2021. It's a simple acknowledgement of a family's long struggle and ultimate victory, a reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, can finally come to light. The island paradise that had welcomed Nancy Anderson in 1972 with promises of new beginnings had failed to protect her from the violence that ended her young life. But 5 decades later, Hawaii kept a different promise, that her death would not be forgotten, that her killer would eventually face justice, and that her story would serve as proof that persistence and science can triumph over time and silence. For David Anderson, now in his 70s himself, the conviction marked the end of a lifelong mission inherited from his mother. He had kept faith with Nancy's memory and Helen's determination, proving that some bonds between siblings, between mothers and children, between the living and the dead, are stronger than time itself. The case files on Nancy Anderson's murder, once a source of frustration for generations of investigators, now serve as a training tool for forensic genealogists and cold case detectives. Her story is taught in police academies and criminal justice programs, an example of how new technologies can breathe life into old investigations. But perhaps the most important lesson of Nancy Anderson's case is simpler and more human, that love persists beyond death, that families never truly give up, and that justice, however delayed, can still arrive for those who wait and fight and believe that truth will eventually prevail. In the end, Nancy Anderson got something that had been denied to her for nearly 50 years, the last word. Her killer lived free for 5 decades, but he died in prison, his name forever linked to the brutal crime he thought he had gotten away with. The young woman who had come to paradise seeking a new life had finally found the justice that had eluded her in death, proving that some stories, no matter how long forgotten, are worth telling to the very end. 5 years have passed since Tudor Chirila's conviction, and the ripple effects of Nancy Anderson's case continue to spread across the landscape of cold case investigations. The techniques used to identify her killer have been refined and replicated hundreds of times, bringing closure to families who had given up hope and putting criminals behind bars who thought they had escaped justice forever. Detective Lisa Chen, now retired but still consulting on cold cases, keeps a photograph of Nancy Anderson on her desk at home. It's the same picture that appeared in newspapers when Nancy first went missing, a young woman with bright eyes and an infectious smile, wearing the kind of optimistic expression that comes with believing the future holds unlimited possibilities. She was the case that taught me never to give up, Chen says, looking at the photograph. Even when the trail went cold, even when years passed without progress, Nancy was still there, waiting for someone to find the truth. As it turned out, was more complex than anyone had imagined during those first frantic days of investigation in 1972. Tudor Chirila hadn't been a random drifter or a crime of passion. He had been a calculating killer who had traveled to Hawaii with unclear motives and had managed to return to the mainland without arousing suspicion. Investigators eventually pieced together more of his story through interviews with former acquaintances and a careful examination of his financial records. Chirila had been struggling to establish his law practice in Nevada when he made his fateful trip to Hawaii. Whether Nancy Anderson had been a specific target or a victim of opportunity remained unclear. Chirila had taken those secrets to his grave. What was clear was the sophistication of his deception. For nearly 50 years, he had lived a double life with remarkable success. His law practice had thrived, his marriage had lasted 4 decades, and his adult children had grown up never suspecting their father was capable of violence. The revelation of his crimes had devastated his family, adding another layer of tragedy to Nancy Anderson's story. David Anderson, now 73, has become an advocate for cold case investigations and victim families. He speaks regularly at conferences and training sessions, sharing his family's story as an example of the importance of persistence and the power of advancing technology. His message is always the same: never give up, because you never know when a breakthrough might come. "My mother died believing Nancy would get justice someday," he tells audiences. "She was right, but she didn't live to see it. That's the hardest part, knowing she never got to see the end of the story." The story, however, hasn't truly ended. Nancy Anderson's case inspired changes in how evidence is preserved and how cold cases are prioritized. Her name appears in legislation supporting funding for DNA testing and genetic genealogy programs. Medical examiners and crime lab technicians receive training on evidence preservation techniques developed in part from lessons learned in her case. More importantly, her story has given hope to thousands of other families dealing with unsolved crimes. Support groups for victim families now regularly cite Nancy's case as proof that justice can come even after decades of waiting. Online forums dedicated to cold cases feature her photograph and case details, inspiring amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike. CE Moore, the genetic genealogist whose work identified Chirila, has solved hundreds of cases since Nancy's, but she still considers the Anderson case one of her most significant achievements. Nancy's case showed that genetic genealogy could work even with very old evidence. Moore explains, "It opened the door for so many other families to find answers. Techniques Moore pioneered have evolved and improved dramatically since 2019. What took months of painstaking work then can now be accomplished in weeks. Databases have grown exponentially, increasing the chances of finding genetic matches. Success stories that once seemed miraculous now happen regularly, though each one still represents a family's long journey toward truth." In Hawaii, Nancy Anderson's legacy lives on in ways both large and small. The Honolulu Police Department has established a victims advocacy program that provides support and regular updates to families of cold case victims. The program is housed in a building on Baratania Street, just a few miles from the Keomoku Street apartment where Nancy lived and died. Tourist guidebooks don't mention Nancy Anderson, and her story isn't part of the sunny narrative that draws millions of visitors to Hawaii each year. But among those who work in law enforcement and victim advocacy, her name carries weight. She represents both the vulnerability of young people far from home and the determination of families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. The apartment building where Nancy lived has been demolished and replaced with a modern condominium complex. There's no marker or memorial at the site, just expensive units with ocean views, occupied by people who have never heard of the young woman who died there in 1972. But a few blocks away, in a small pocket park, someone, perhaps David Anderson during one of his visits to Hawaii, has planted a small plumeria tree with a discreet plaque that reads simply, "In memory of Nancy Anderson, 1952 to 1972. The plumeria blooms year-round, its sweet fragrance carried on the same trade winds that once brought Nancy comfort during her brief time in paradise." Passers-by rarely notice the tree or read the plaque, but it serves as a quiet reminder that Nancy Anderson was more than a victim, more than a cold case file number. She was a young woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her, whose story deserves to be remembered, not just for how it ended, but for how it began, and all the possibilities it represented. Tudor Chirila's grave in a small Nevada cemetery bears only his name and dates 1944 to 2023. His family, devastated by the revelations about his past, chose not to include any personal inscription or remembrance. In death, as in life after his conviction, he remains a figure defined by the violence he committed, rather than any positive contributions he might have made. The contrast between Nancy's memorial and Chirila's grave says everything about how their stories will be remembered. Nancy, dead for more than 50 years, is celebrated for her courage in seeking a new life and mourned for the future that was stolen from her. Chirila, who lived free for nearly 5 decades after his crime, is remembered only as the man who took that future away. Time has a way of clarifying such distinctions. The passage of years has only made Nancy Anderson's story more powerful, not less. Each new cold case solved using genetic genealogy references her case as a precedent. Each family that receives long-awaited answers thinks of the Anderson family's decades of waiting. Each killer brought to justice years after their crime remembers that Tudor Chirila thought he had gotten away with murder too. The final lesson of Nancy Anderson's story may be the simplest one, that truth has its own timeline, independent of human impatience or despair. Her family waited 49 years for answers, but the answers came. Justice was delayed, but it was not denied. The killer lived free for decades, but he did not escape. In courtrooms and crime labs, in victim advocacy centers and police stations, Nancy Anderson's name continues to be spoken with respect and purpose. She has become more than a symbol. She is proof that some promises, once made, will eventually be kept, no matter how long it takes. Her story reminds us that every cold case represents not just an unsolved puzzle, but a family's unfinished business with grief. Every breakthrough celebrates not just the triumph of science and persistence, but the enduring power of love to transcend time and death. Nancy Anderson came to Hawaii seeking paradise. She found tragedy instead, but her story ultimately became something else entirely, a testament to the idea that truth, however long buried, will eventually surface, and that justice, however delayed, can still transform sorrow into resolution. The Hawaiian word ohana means family, but it encompasses more than blood relationships. It includes chosen bonds and lasting commitments that persist beyond physical presence. By that definition, Nancy Anderson's ohana extended far beyond her biological relatives, to include the investigators who never stopped seeking her killer, the scientists who developed the technologies that identified him, and the families around the world who draw strength from her story. They are all part of her legacy now, carrying forward her memory and the lessons learned from her case. In the end, that may be the most important truth of all, that Nancy Anderson, who died alone and afraid in a small apartment in 1972, was never really alone at all. She was surrounded by an ohana that spanned decades and continents, united by the belief that her life mattered and her death deserved justice. That justice came 50 years late, but it came. And in its arrival, Nancy Anderson finally found the peace that had eluded her family for half a century, proving that some stories never truly end. They just wait for the right moment to find their proper conclusion. The conviction of Tudor Chirila created waves that extended far beyond the specific details of Nancy Anderson's murder. In law enforcement agencies across the United States, cold case units began requesting funding for genetic genealogy programs, citing the Anderson case as proof that decades-old crimes could still be solved with the right tools and persistence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began studying Chirila's life pattern, trying to understand how a killer could successfully hide in plain sight for 50 years. Their analysis revealed a profile that challenged many assumptions about violent criminals. Chirila had shown no signs of escalating behavior, no pattern of increasingly serious crimes, no obvious psychological deterioration. He had committed one brutal murder, and then apparently stopped, living what appeared to be a normal life for the remainder of his years. The Chirila case forces us to reconsider what we think we know about criminal behavior, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, a forensic psychologist who studied the case files extensively. We tend to assume that people who commit violent crimes will continue that pattern, but Chirila suggests that some killers may be capable of compartmentalizing their actions in ways we don't fully understand. This analysis had practical implications for other cold case investigations. Detectives began looking at suspects who had lived seemingly respectable lives, understanding that a clean record after a certain date didn't necessarily eliminate someone from consideration for earlier crimes. The Chirila effect, as some investigators called it, led to renewed scrutiny of suspects who had previously been dismissed because of their subsequent good behavior. In Nevada, the revelation about Chirila's double life devastated the legal community, where he had practiced for decades. The State Bar Association conducted a thorough review of his cases, looking for any signs that his criminal past might have affected his legal work. They found none. His client files were meticulous, his billing practices honest, his professional relationships cordial. It was as if he had been two completely different people. Tudor was one of the most ethical lawyers I knew, said Judge Robert Harrison, who had known Chirila for 30 years. He handled estate planning with such care and compassion. I've been trying to reconcile that man with the person who was convicted of murder, and I honestly can't do it. It's like they were two different people occupying the same body. Chirila's wife, Maria, filed for divorce after his conviction, though she waited until after his death to speak publicly about her experience. In a rare interview with the Las Vegas Review-Journal in 2024, she described living with a man she thought she knew completely, only to discover that their entire marriage had been built on a foundation of deception. Tudor was a good husband and father for 40 years, Maria said, her voice still carrying the shock of her discovery. He was gentle, patient, never showed any signs of violence or anger. He helped our children with homework, coached Little League, attended every school event. How do you reconcile that with what he did in Hawaii? I've been in therapy for 3 years, and I still don't understand it. The impact on Chirila's children was equally devastating. His son, Michael Chirila, was a high school teacher in Sacramento when news of his father's arrest broke. Students and parents who knew about his connection to the case treated him with suspicion and pity in equal measure, eventually forcing him to take early retirement and move to a different state. I lost my father twice, Michael said during a victim impact statement read at Chirila's sentencing. First, when I learned what he had done, and then when he died in prison. The father I grew up with, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with college applications, that man never existed. He was just a mask my father wore to hide who he really was. The psychological toll on Chirila's family became another aspect of Nancy Anderson's legacy. Victim advocacy groups began addressing the needs of criminals' families, recognizing that they too were victims of violent crime in their own way. Support groups formed specifically for families who discovered that their loved ones had committed serious crimes, providing counseling and resources for dealing with the shame, confusion, and grief that such revelations brought. David Anderson, despite his own family's suffering, became an advocate for these secondary victims. Tudor Chirila's family didn't choose his actions, he said during a conference on victim services. They're dealing with their own trauma from learning the truth. Compassion doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can seek justice for Nancy while also acknowledging the pain that justice caused to innocent people. This perspective helped heal some of the divisions that high-profile cold case solutions often created. Instead of pitting victim families against the families of perpetrators, Nancy's case became an example of how justice could be pursued with empathy for all those affected by violent crime. The scientific advances that led to Chirila's identification continued to evolve rapidly after Nancy's case was solved. By 2024, genetic genealogy had become so sophisticated that cases that took months to solve in 2019 could be resolved in weeks or even days. Public DNA databases had grown exponentially, increasing the chances of finding familial matches for unknown suspects. C.E. Moore, who had identified Chirila, established a training program for forensic genealogists, using Nancy Anderson's case as a foundational example. Students learned not just the technical aspects of genetic analysis, but also the human elements: how to communicate with grieving families, how to verify potential matches responsibly, and how to handle the emotional weight of bringing decades-old secrets to light. Every case we solve represents a family that's been waiting for answers, Moore told her students. Nancy Anderson's family waited 49 years. When you're working through the technical challenges of building family trees and analyzing DNA profiles, remember that there are real people on the other end of your work whose lives will be forever changed by what you discover. The Anderson case also influenced how evidence was collected and preserved at crime scenes. Recognizing that DNA technology would continue to advance, forensic teams began collecting and storing biological evidence with even greater care, understanding that material deemed untestable in 2024 might yield crucial information in 2044. Police academies began teaching courses on future-proofing investigations, emphasizing the importance of thorough documentation and evidence preservation, even when current technology couldn't analyze all available materials. Nancy Anderson's case became required reading, illustrating how evidence collected with 1,972 technology had eventually solved a case using 2019 science. The media coverage of Nancy's case also evolved over time, becoming more sensitive to the needs of victim families and more focused on the investigative techniques rather than sensationalizing the violence. Documentary producers and true crime podcasters who covered the case worked closely with David Anderson to ensure that Nancy was remembered as a person, not just a victim. Too many true crime stories focus on the killer and make the victim just a plot point, said documentary filmmaker James Wong, who produced a feature-length film about Nancy's case. We wanted to show who Nancy was before she became a victim, her hopes, her courage in moving to Hawaii, the life she was trying to build. The crime is important, but Nancy's humanity is what makes the story meaningful. This approach influenced how other cold cases were covered in the media, leading to more thoughtful portrayals that honored victims' memories while still exploring the investigative processes that led to justice. The Nancy Anderson Standard, as some journalists called it, emphasized the importance of telling complete stories, rather than just focusing on the most sensational elements. In academic circles, Nancy's case became a subject of study across multiple disciplines. Criminologists analyzed the behavioral patterns that had allowed Chirila to evade detection for decades. Sociologists examined how communities processed the revelation that a killer had lived among them undetected. Ethicists debated the implications of genetic genealogy for privacy and civil liberties. Law schools began including the Anderson case in courses on criminal procedure and evidence, using it to illustrate how changing technology could affect legal strategies and court proceedings. The case raised questions about statute of limitations laws, the reliability of decades-old evidence, and the rights of suspects identified through genetic genealogy. Nancy Anderson's case is a perfect example of how law enforcement, science, and legal procedure intersect in the modern era, explained Professor Lisa Chen at the University of Hawaii Law School. It shows us how cases that seemed impossible to solve can be cracked with new technology, but it also raises important questions about privacy, due process, and the balance between justice and individual rights. These academic discussions had practical implications for future investigations. Courts began establishing precedents for how genetic genealogy evidence could be used in criminal proceedings. Defense attorneys developed strategies for challenging DNA evidence that had been stored for decades. Prosecutors learned to present complex scientific evidence in ways that juries could understand and evaluate. The international implications of Nancy's case were equally significant. Law enforcement agencies in countries around the world began requesting assistance with their own cold cases, hoping to use American databases and genetic genealogy techniques to solve crimes in their jurisdictions. Nancy Anderson's name became known in police stations from London to Sydney, representing the global potential of modern forensic science. Interpol began developing protocols for sharing genetic information across international borders, with Nancy's case serving as an example of how crimes could be solved even when suspects had moved far from the original crime scene. The possibility that Chirila might have committed other crimes during his travels in the early 1972 remained an open question, one that continued to interest investigators years after his death. The psychological impact of Nancy's case on the investigators who worked it over the decades became another area of study. Detective Robert Kauakahi, who had worked the case from the beginning until his retirement, spoke candidly about the toll that unsolved cases took on law enforcement personnel. "Nancy Anderson was with me for 23 years, Kauakahi said during a conference on officer wellness. "I thought about her case every day, wondered what I might have missed, what other approaches we could have tried. When it was finally solved, I felt relief, but also a kind of emptiness. That case had been such a big part of my identity as a detective. Closure for the family was everything. But it left me wondering what to do with all that mental energy I'd been spending on Nancy's case for decades." This perspective led to the development of support programs for detectives working long-term cold cases, recognizing that the emotional investment required to pursue justice for years or decades could take a significant psychological toll. Nancy's case became an example of both the importance of persistence in cold case work and the need to support the officers who carried that burden. The technological legacy of Nancy's case continued to evolve, even after Chirila's conviction and death. Research laboratories began developing even more sophisticated DNA analysis techniques, some of which were tested on evidence from Nancy's case. Her DNA profile became part of a research database used to refine genetic genealogy methods, ensuring that her case would continue to contribute to scientific advancement long after justice had been served. "Nancy Anderson's case launched a revolution in cold case investigations," said Dr. Mark Patterson, director of the National Institute of Justice's Forensic Science Program. "Every technique we've developed since then has been influenced in some way by the lessons learned from her case. She's helped solve not just her own murder, but hundreds of other crimes through the advances her case inspired." By 2025, 3 years after Chirila's death, the ripple effects of Nancy Anderson's case had touched thousands of lives across multiple continents. Families had received closure on decades-old cases. Criminals who thought they had escaped justice found themselves facing trial for crimes committed years or decades earlier. Scientific techniques had advanced dramatically, making previously impossible investigations routine. But perhaps the most important legacy was more personal and immediate: the message Nancy's case sent to families still waiting for answers about their own loved ones. Every few months, David Anderson received letters or emails from people dealing with unsolved crimes, drawing strength from his family's story and finding hope in the proof that justice could come even after seemingly impossible delays. "If Nancy could get justice after 49 years, then my daughter can too," wrote one mother whose child had been murdered 20 years earlier. "Your family never gave up, and neither will I." These messages reminded David that Nancy's story had become larger than just one family's pursuit of justice. It had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been told that a case was too old, too cold, or too complicated to solve. Nancy Anderson, who had died alone and afraid in a small apartment in Hawaii, had become a source of strength for people she had never met, facing challenges she had never experienced. The young woman who had crossed the continent, seeking new opportunities, had ultimately created opportunities for countless others: families seeking justice, scientists developing new techniques, investigators refusing to give up on impossible cases. Her death had been a tragedy, but her legacy had become something powerful and enduring, proof that some stories are too important to remain unfinished, no matter how long it takes to write their proper endings. In the end, Nancy Anderson got more than justice. She got immortality of a sort, her name forever associated with the triumph of truth over time, science over secrecy, and persistence over despair. Every cold case solved using genetic genealogy carries a small piece of her story forward, ensuring that the 19-year-old who dreamed of a new life in paradise will never be truly forgotten. Her case proved that some promises, once made, will eventually be kept, and some debts, once incurred, will eventually be paid, no matter how much time passes or how impossible the odds seem. Tudor Chirila thought he had gotten away with murder, but Nancy Anderson had the last word, after all, spoken through the voices of those who refused to let her story end in silence and darkness. The trade winds still blow through Honolulu, carrying the scent of plumeria and the sound of the ocean. Tourists still come seeking paradise, just as Nancy Anderson did more than 50 years ago. Most of them never learn her story, but it continues to unfold anyway, in crime labs and courtrooms, in training academies and university classrooms, wherever people gather to study the long, complex relationship between justice and time. Nancy Anderson came to Hawaii, seeking a new beginning. She found a violent ending instead, but from that ending came a different kind of beginning, one that continues to unfold decades later, bringing hope to families, justice to victims, and consequences to criminals who thought they had escaped both. That may be the most fitting memorial of all, not a statue or plaque, but a living legacy that continues to grow and change and help others, proving that Nancy Anderson's brief life had meaning that extended far beyond her tragic death. She had wanted to make something of herself in Hawaii, and in the end, she did exactly that, though not in any way she could have imagined when she first stepped off the plane into the warm Pacific air with hope in her heart and dreams of the future stretching endlessly before her.